just explain what exactly do you mean when you say childhood trauma?
Well, geez, I'm so glad to be able to talk about that, because that's another word that's, on the one hand, not appreciated, understood, even recognized by much of medical practice. On the one hand, on the other hand, is used too loosely sometimes. So people say, I went to a movie last night and I was really traumatized. No, you weren't. You just were upset. You were sad. You were, angry. But that doesn't mean you were traumatized. So what does it mean? What does trauma mean? Well, again, if you look at the word origins, the origin of the word trauma is a Greek phrase for wounding or a wound. So trauma is a wound that you sustained. Now, when people think of the word trauma, they often believe it has to do with what we call the big T events, the big trauma events, such as sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, a parent dying, violence in the family, parental addiction, maybe a rancorous divorce. These are traumatic, but trauma is not what happened to you. Trauma is what happened inside you as a result of what happened to you. So trauma is the psychic wound that you sustained. So that's the first point. The second point is, if we understand the nature of a wound, really there's two ways to look at a wound. If it stays open, it's very sore. You touch it. If I pat myself on the shoulder right now, I feel no pain. But if there was a wound there and my shoulder was bare and my nerve endings were close to the surface, in other words, if I was thin-skinned, and if I tap myself with the same force, there'd be severe pain. So one aspect of trauma is like an open sore that if you touch it, you just react like you were just wounded all over again. That's one aspect of a wound. The other way to look at a wound is that it forms a scar. The scar tissue protects the wound, but at the same time it's thick, it's inflexible, it's hard, it's not capable of growth, and it lacks nerve endings, so you don't feel. So trauma both sensitizes us to certain stimuli, and on the other hand, numbs us to our own feelings and separates us from our bodies because it's too painful to be in our bodies. Now, to traumatize people, you can do bad things to them, as I mentioned earlier. But you can also wound people, particularly sensitive kids, but all kids, but especially highly sensitive children, not just by doing bad things to them, but by not giving them the good things that they need. So it's not just what shouldn't have happened but did, but what should have happened but didn't. So for this, we have to understand children's basic needs. Children have certain developmental needs for healthy emotional and brain development.
Yeah.
One of them is to be seen and heard and to be accepted for. How about you push down your emotions? You push down your emotions when to feel them puts you at odds with your environment. So that if your parents can't handle your verve and your enthusiasm, or your sadness or your grief or your anger, then in order to fit in with the family environment, you will push down those feelings, not consciously, but simply as a matter of automatic adaptation. 30 years later, you're diagnosed with this disease called depression. But it was a response to a childhood wounding, the wounding of not being seen and accepted with all your emotions, which is another essential need of the child. The child should be able to experience all their emotions, no matter what they are. So that's a very simple example of childhood wounding trauma, which then shows up in the form of adult distress. And I can show the similar patterns for all manner of chronic illness, that there was childhood wounding, either because of things happening that shouldn't have, or what I call the small t trauma of things not happening that should have, that then leads to adaptations, which adaptations in the long term promote illness.
Yeah. There's a couple of things there, right? So childhood trauma then shows up later in a whole variety of different behaviors, a whole variety of different diseases.
Yeah.
Right. So there's the question there is then, as an adult, how can we start addressing this? But there's also another piece, which is many people listening or watching are parents themselves.
Yeah.
And they may recognize certain things and certain behaviors they've had in their own life as I certainly have done. But there's also, well, how do we not traumatize, or shall I say, minimize the trauma that we put onto our kids? What are those? If we maybe start there,
Yeah.
Because we're living in a society where it's very hard to be a parent, it's very hard to be a mother.
It's very hard.
Really hard. And actually, through no fault of parents, they're struggling to be present and have time and patience with their children. I know in the book you write that being understood as a child is as much of a need as food and shelter, which I found really profound.
Yeah.
Being understood, being seen, being heard.
Yeah.
Right. So what can parents think about when trying to bring up their kids?
So first of all, it's very important to avoid any hint of parent blaming.
Yeah.
As you say. And so it's not a matter of individual failure. It's really a question of a society that doesn't put children's needs in the forefront at all. And so let's take a really simple example. Now, in the book, I talk about my personal history, which is, a Jewish infant under Nazi occupation in Hungary. Very dramatic, be a terrible time in history to be an infant.
Yeah.
And my mother and I live under really deplorable conditions, under threat of death. And at one point, she gives me up to a total stranger in the street. By the way, I was just in Budapest, my home city, 2 weeks ago, and I swam every morning at a sports club. It was right across the house where my mother gave me to a stranger.
Oh, wow.
77 years ago, to save my life. So that's very dramatic. But forget the Nazis, forget genocide, forget the war. When my mother and I are still in the hospital, maternity hospital, and I'm 2 weeks old, she writes, so it's not time yet. You're going to have to learn that nighttime is for sleeping, not for eating. Her heart was breaking. She's completely suppressing her parental instinct to please the doctor. So forget the war, forget the genocide, forget all the drama. Just a mom, a 24-year-old mom, following doctor's orders. Now, in this society, parents are often advised to ignore their kids' needs, just like that. For example, you have this thing called sleep training, where parents are told, don't pick up the crying child. But we tell human beings this every day, and we call this sleep training, and what we're doing is giving the child the message. It works. You ignore a child's cries for 4 nights, they're going to sleep through the night. You know why? Because they give up. And they can't stand it. They put themselves to sleep just to get away from the distress of it. And their brain is flooded with cortisol, which interferes with healthy brain development. And the message they get is that their feelings don't matter, that they're on their own, they're all alone. Now, this is done by loving parents under the advice of well-meaning professionals, and we call this parenting advice. Or another simple little device that parents are often told to do, time out. Now, there's a very famous Canadian psychologist who I don't need to name, but in his mega-selling book, he advises parents that an angry little child should be made to sit by themselves until they come back to normal. It's not normal for a 2-year-old to be angry, and that child should be excluded. The message the child should get is, you're not acceptable to us when you have that emotion. A lot of parents, there's best-selling books on this technique of time out, which basically means separating the child from yourself until they start behaving in ways that you can approve of. In other words, the message to the child is, your acceptance is purely conditional on your pleasing me. Now, we're not talking about parents that are beating their kids. We're not talking about parents who don't love their kids. We're not talking about parents who are trying to hurt their kids. We're just talking about parents who are complying with social norms and social values. Then there's the factor of stress that you mentioned, how stressful it is to be parenting. Again, we're not meant to parent in isolated homes, in one-person or two-parent families. We're meant to parent in groups, in community. This is how we evolved as a species. We know already, and I spent chapters on this, that chapter on prenatal life, that stress on the pregnant woman. So stress on pregnant women. Now, how are we taking care of pregnant women in our society? Are we honoring their needs? Are we making provisions for them on the job, or even to give them prenatal leave to take care of themselves? Or are we telling husbands to really look after their wives' emotional needs? I mean, I talk about in the book about just what an unsupportive husband I was when I was, when we were expecting our children. That has an impact on the developing child already in the womb. Not because the mother doesn't love the child, but because when she's stressed, that stress translates into physiological impacts on the child. Now, there are times in the first year of life when every second, millions of circuits, millions of connections are being made in the brain. The mother's emotional states directly affect the brain development of the child. We know this from scientific studies. How are we taking care of new mothers in this society? What support are we giving them? How do we ensure that they have the best possible environment to raise that child? And so what I'm saying is that this society is so stressful. And look, in Britain, I'm in Britain right now. I read the newspaper. 10% inflation rate while the economy is shrinking. How does that affecting, one of the triggers for stress is uncertainty.
Yeah.
So this is a society, this rich society, that massively stresses its population. And those stressed parents then are supposed to raise healthy children.
Yeah.
So that with lousy advice from experts to ignore the child's needs. I'm not even talking about trauma in the big sense.
Yeah. You've been very open in the book about things that maybe you could have done better, whether it's...
To say the least.
Yeah, and it's, it's interesting. It's very insightful to read that from you. And I guess as you talk about your children there and how you maybe didn't give your wife as much support as you could have done, or writing about more and more the research on the long-term implications of that.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that now? Have you made peace with it? Or do you beat yourself up?
The story's worth telling. It was my birthday party, and we had gathered at my parents' place. My mother made me a traditional Hungarian meal, for my birthday. And my brothers were there with their wives, their families, my parents, my wife and I, and our eldest son, 3 years old. And Daniel, my co-writer on this book, announces, "I'm not singing Happy Birthday." And I said, "If you're not singing, you're not getting cake." "Well, I'm not singing anyway." I get more and more angry. Everybody's begging me to desist. Everybody's begging me to lay off. The more they ask me to do that, the more angry I get. I ended up hitting him. No, what was that all about? He was just being a 3-year-old. He says, "I'm going to assert my own personality. I'm not going to go along with the crowd, I might have said, "Hey, Daniel, sweetheart, don't sing, just have the cake and enjoy it." What was being triggered in me is the sense I developed as a young child that I wasn't loved and lovable. So I needed this 3-year-old to prove to me that I was lovable. When he didn't, I got enraged. I'm not either criticizing myself or defending myself. I'm just saying, this is what happened. This is how we passed on our trauma unwittingly. So one of the pieces of advice I give to parents is, deal with your trauma as much as you can, as you have children and before you have children and as you're raising them. Now, in terms of my own trajectory with my kids, we've done a lot of repair. But to young parents, I would say, don't make the repair necessary. Yeah. Work on your own stuff. You learned something very important about yourself as your 6-month-old got ill. And I've heard you say that the greatest value to you is not your success as a physician or anything else, but the healthy raising of your children. So what I would say to parents is really do a valuation of what's important to you. And to use your phrase, look at how your life is aligned with what your best intentions are when it comes to that. Even in this stressful society with all the pressures on you, has its core value the genuine needs and well-being of your children, you're going to do okay.